Did a single American bomb just shatter a military idea Iran trusted for decades? What if the real story is not the blast you saw, but the fear it may have planted inside every underground base that still has not been hit? If you want clear, serious breakdowns without the noise, tap like, subscribe, and share this with one person who loves understanding the story behind the headline. For years, one of the safest assumptions in modern warfare sounded simple. If you bury your most important weapons deep enough inside. A mountain. Air power can scare you, damage the surface, maybe block a tunnel, but it cannot truly reach the heart of what you are hiding. That belief shaped real military planning. It shaped concrete, steel, logistics, and billions of dollars in effort. It shaped where missiles were stored, where fuel was moved, where launch crews trained, and where leaders thought they could still hold leverage even after losing control of the sky. Now that belief is under pressure, reports about a U.S. strike on an underground Iranian missile complex have triggered a wave of dramatic claims. Some people are calling it a total knockout. Others are saying it changed almost nothing. The truth, as usual, sits in the harder middle. And that middle is where this story gets serious, because this is not just about one bomb. It is about a long contest between two ideas. One side keeps digging deeper, the other side keeps building weapons that can go deeper still. One side hides inside rock. The other side studies the rock, studies the entrances, studies heat patterns, traffic patterns, support buildings, and tries to answer a brutal question. If the target is inside the mountain, how do you make the mountain stop protecting it? That is the question at the center of this entire story. To understand why this matters, you have to start with Iran's problem. Iran has never had the kind of air force that could comfortably match the United States in an open fight. Sanctions, age, maintenance problems, and technology gaps all matter here. If you know you cannot reliably dominate the air, you look for another path. You look for ways to survive long enough to keep threatening your enemy after the first wave of strikes. You look for something harder to find, harder to hit, and harder to destroy. That is where the mountain comes in. An underground military complex is not just a cave with missiles stacked inside. At least in theory, it is a whole system. You need tunnel access. You need storage bays. You need power. You need ventilation. You need internal movement routes. You may need maintenance space, security zones, and protected areas where launch equipment can be prepared with less risk from surveillance. If the complex is meant to support real operations, then it also needs links to roads, supply lines, crews, and timing. It becomes a living machine under rock. And once you build a machine like that, it starts to create a pattern, even if you try to hide it. The entrances matter, the support buildings matter, trucks matter, fresh earth matters, reinforced road sections matter, ventilation shafts matter, heat signatures matter, changes over time matter. A place can stay silent on a map for years, but if someone is patient enough, the silence starts speaking. That is one reason these underground facilities are both impressive and vulnerable at the same time. They are impressive because they reflect planning, money, and strategic discipline. But they are vulnerable because their purpose creates habits, and habits can be studied. Now add a second layer to this. If you are Iran, underground missile storage is not just a defensive trick. It is part of deterrence. It sends a message. Even if you strike us, we can still hit back. Even if you damage airfields, we still have missiles. Even if you break the surface, we still have depth. That message matters not only to enemies, but also to allies, proxies, regional rivals, and domestic audiences. It becomes part of political theater, military psychology, and bargaining power. That is why any strike on such a site creates so much attention. People are not just asking what exploded, they're asking what belief exploded with it. And that leads us to the weapon itself. Multiple reports describe the strike as involving a modern U.S. deep penetration bomb, widely identified in coverage as the GBU-72, a 5,000-pound class bunker-busting munition designed for hardened, buried targets. If that reporting is correct, then this was not a bomb meant simply to smash the outside of a mountain and call it a day. It was meant to go after something protected by depth, density, and layers. That difference is everything. A normal strike against a surface target is about blast, fragmentation, accuracy, and timing. A strike against a deeply buried target begins with a different problem. The bomb has to survive impact. It has to stay intact while slamming through material that wants to tear it apart. It has to keep moving. It has to delay its explosion long enough to avoid wasting its force in the wrong place. If it blows too early, the mountain wins. If it breaks too soon, the mountain wins. If it stops short, the mountain wins. So the whole design challenge becomes a kind of violent precision. You need strength, weight, guidance, fuse control, and just enough patience inside the weapon to wait until it reaches the part that matters. That sounds technical, but the human meaning is easy to understand. The difference between hitting a tunnel entrance and hitting the chamber behind that entrance is the difference between knocking on a locked door and lighting the whole room on fire. And if that room contains missiles, propellant, or warheads, then the first explosion may not be the one people remember. That is why footage from these kinds of strikes can be so dramatic. The initial hit may look sharp and contained, but if the target really includes stored weapons or fuel, secondary explosions can follow in waves. Those follow-on blasts are often the clue that turns a loud video into a serious strategic event. They suggest the bomb did not just scar the outside. They suggest it found something worth destroying. Still, we need to slow down here. Big fireballs do not answer every important question. A mountain can produce terrifying footage and still keep some of its deepest functions alive. A sealed entrance can stop operations for a long time, but it is not always the same as total destruction. Surface damage can be severe. Support equipment can be lost, movement can be disrupted, and the core launch shafts or deepest chambers may still be partly intact. This is exactly where online coverage often becomes useless. One camp says everything was obliterated. Another says the strike was symbolic. Neither extreme helps you understand what likely happened. The better question is this: what kind of damage changes real? Military options, even if the target is not reduced to nothing? That answer can be surprisingly broad. If a strike collapses or blocks key access points, that alone can matter. If it destroys transport vehicles, loading gear, support buildings, power links, or above-ground command nodes, that matters. If it forces crews to dig, relocate, delay, or expose themselves to follow-up surveillance, that matters. If it makes every similar facility look less safe than it looked yesterday, that matters too. Because strategy is not only about what is destroyed, it is also about what no longer feels secure. And security is a weapon all by itself. Here is the part most casual coverage misses. Underground sites do not become powerful only because of the rock above them. They become powerful because people inside the system trust that rock. They trust the depth. They trust the engineering. They trust the old calculations that told them what previous weapons could and could not do. Once that trust cracks, planning changes. Construction changes. Storage behavior changes. Commanders start asking new questions. Which sites are still safe? Which entrances are now obvious? Which patterns were already mapped? Which stockpiles should move? Which movements will now be watched? That kind of doubt does not appear in a blast video, but it may be the most lasting effect. And this is where the story becomes bigger than one strike. There has been a long, quiet race between hardening and penetration. States bury deeper. Their opponents improve fuses, materials, guidance, and delivery options. One side thinks in concrete thickness and mountain cover. The other thinks in angle, speed, impact stress, and delayed detonation. The race is not always visible to the public, but it is always there. When one side suddenly proves a new level of reach, the balance of that race shifts. That is why a reported combat use of a weapon like the GBU-72 matters far beyond one mountain. It tells every military planner watching that some old assumptions may now be stale. If you're still with me, pause for a second and drop a comment with the word deeper, so I know you're watching for the full story, not just the explosion. Now let's talk about how a strike like this even happens in the first place, because movies have badly trained people to imagine war as instant improvisation. Real targeting of hardened underground sites is usually the opposite. It is slow before it becomes fast. You do not wake up one morning, point at a mountain, and decide that today is the day. Not if the target matters. First comes observation, then more observation, then comparison over time. Satellite passes, road activity, construction phases, soil disturbance, support facilities, the shape of entrances, the way vehicles approach and leave, the kind of protection built around the visible points, whether the area shows the fingerprints of a real operating site or the emptiness of a decoy. And yes, decoys matter. Any military that spends decades building hidden infrastructure also spends time thinking about deception. False entrances, misleading cuts in rock, empty tunnel mouths, fake support zones, and carefully managed signatures can all be part of the game. The point is simple. If your enemy is carrying expensive precision weapons, make them spend one on useless stone. So the intelligence contest before the strike can be just as important as the strike itself. A bunker buster is only as smart as the targeting behind it. This is one reason. Reported secondary explosions attract so much attention from analysts. They can function like a harsh kind of confirmation. If the strike sets off stored material inside the complex, then the weapon likely reached something operational. That does not reveal the full damage picture, but it suggests the bomb did not die against empty rock. Another key factor is delivery speed. The largest American bunker-busting weapons are famous because of their size, but size creates its own limits. Some of the heaviest penetrators require rare aircraft, long missions, and heavy planning. A smaller but still powerful penetrator that can be carried by aircraft already in the region changes the equation. It makes the response faster. It makes the threat more flexible. It lowers the time between fresh intelligence and action. That matters in a real conflict. If a target is fixed and known for months, you can plan around it. If missiles are moving, if commanders are shifting stockpiles, if opportunities appear and disappear in hours, then the weapon that gets there faster may matter more than the weapon with the biggest headline value. That is one reason reporting on the GBU-72 caught attention. In simple terms, it appears to represent a blend of serious penetration capability with more practical deployment options than the absolute heaviest bombs in the U.S. inventory. If that is the role it now plays, then underground targets face not just a more dangerous bomb, but a bomb that may also be easier to use on short notice. That is a nasty combination. It means the window of safety may shrink. It also means buried infrastructure may have to adapt in ways that are expensive, slow, and politically painful. Digging deeper sounds simple when people say it fast. In reality, it can mean years of labor, new engineering, new secrecy problems, new transportation routes, new support facilities, and new vulnerabilities during construction. Every answer to a penetrator can create another signature for intelligence services to follow. So when people ask whether one strike changes anything, that is the wrong frame. One strike can change planning even if it does not erase a program. And Iran's missile program is too important to treat casually. For Tehran, missiles are not just weapons in storage. They are part of how the state projects pressure without matching the United States plane for plane or ship for ship. They are part of signaling to Israel, part of signaling to Gulf states, part of domestic prestige, part of deterrence, part of bargaining, part of the message that Iran can still impose costs, even under sanctions and pressure. That is why deeply buried missile infrastructure matters so much. It is not only about protecting hardware, it is about protecting leverage. Take that leverage away, or even make it look less reliable, and the political consequences spread far beyond the mountain. This is where the story starts to move from engineering into power. Because inside Iran, power has never flowed through only one clean channel. There is formal political leadership, there are diplomatic voices, there are institutions that care about sanctions relief, international legitimacy, and economic survival. But there's also the Revolutionary Guard structure, the security logic, the missile logic, and the belief that strategic pressure is what keeps outside enemies cautious. Those impulses do not always move in perfect sync. So when a site like this is hit, the damage is not only physical, it becomes an argument inside the system. Some actors may see the strike and think, we need to harden more, disperse more, and hit back harder. Others may see the strike and think, the cost of escalation is rising, our assumptions are being tested, and our room to maneuver is shrinking. One bomb cannot settle that internal debate, but it can sharpen it. And when internal debates sharpen during a regional crisis, the rest of the region feels it. Look at the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important energy choke points on Earth. Even the hint of trouble there can move insurance prices, shipping calculations, naval deployments, and energy market nerves. Iran's ability to threaten disruption has always depended partly on credibility. Not just what it says, but what others believe it can still do under pressure. Missiles and drones play a major role in that credibility. If underground storage becomes more vulnerable, then every threat tied to that arsenal is viewed through a slightly different lens. Again, that does not mean the threat disappears. It means the math starts changing. And in military affairs, changing the math is often the point. Now, some viewers will hear all this and ask a fair question. If underground bases are vulnerable, why build them at all? Because they still offer real advantages. Even a penetrable underground site is usually harder to destroy than a warehouse on open ground. Even a strike that succeeds may require high-grade intelligence, the right aircraft, the right timing, and the right weapon. Buried sites can reduce surveillance visibility, protect against lighter munitions, complicate targeting, and slow down an attacker's tempo. They are not useless. They are just not magic. That distinction matters. Military systems rarely go from invincible to worthless in one moment. They move from safer to riskier, from trusted to doubted, from strong enough to maybe not strong enough. That is a slower kind of decline, but often a more important one. If this breakdown is helping you see the bigger picture, send this video to the one friend who hates lazy news and loves the details everyone else skips. There is another layer here that deserves attention. Public narratives after a strike are almost always part of the battle. The attacking side wants deterrence, validation, and psychological effect. The defending side wants calm, denial, resilience, and control of domestic reaction. That means early claims are usually shaped by political need as much as physical reality. So when officials or media voices declare absolute success or dismissive failure within hours, caution is wise. Real damage assessment takes time. Analysts look for crater patterns, entrance condition, terrain shifts, burn marks, collapsed sections, destroyed support buildings, road disruption, and follow-up behavior. Are rescue crews present? Is fresh excavation visible? Are replacement routes being prepared? Do heat patterns continue? Does the site still show life? Sometimes the most revealing question is not what happened on strike day, but what happens 3 days later, 2 weeks later, a month later. That is when you start to see whether a facility was inconvenienced, crippled, or fundamentally changed. And even then, some uncertainty remains. Underground warfare is one of the hardest areas to judge from open information. Rock hides evidence, governments hide evidence, propaganda hides evidence, viral clips hide context. This is why honest analysis sounds less dramatic than social media certainty. Honest analysis leaves room for what is not yet known. So let me give you the strongest, grounded version of the story. A reported U.S. strike appears to have targeted an Iranian underground missile-related facility protected by mountain cover. Coverage widely identified the weapon as a modern deep penetration bomb associated with the GBU-72 class. The central significance of such a strike is not only the visible blast, but the demonstration that hardened underground targets can still be seriously threatened by evolving penetrator technology. The exact level of destruction inside the deepest parts of the complex remains harder to confirm than the headlines suggest. But even severe disruption, short of total destruction, can carry strategic consequences, especially if it undermines confidence in similar sites elsewhere. That is the serious version. And serious matters here, because the temptation to turn every blast into a movie is very strong. But history usually punishes shallow thinking. Remember this: underground protection is part of a larger survival strategy. It works best when combined with mobility, dispersion, deception, redundancy, and the ability to absorb losses without losing the whole force. If one part of that strategy begins to weaken, the rest of the system has to work harder. More sites, more movement, more secrecy, more strain. That strain can reveal itself in surprising ways. You may see more decoys. You may see more relocation. You may see faster transfer cycles. You may see command friction over where to put scarce, high-value missiles. You may see a push for deeper construction in new areas, which then creates fresh patterns visible from space. Every adaptation solves one problem and creates another. That is the curse of hardened infrastructure. Once it matters enough to protect, it becomes heavy, expensive, and difficult to hide forever. This is also why the psychological impact of a bunker-busting strike can exceed the tonnage of the bomb. A successful strike on a supposedly protected complex tells every operator in comparable facilities that the war can come inside. Not just to the gates, not just to the road, but to the chambers themselves. Morale is not abstract in those conditions. It affects speed, discipline, trust, and decision-making. Would you want to sit on stored fuel and warheads inside a mountain after watching another mountain erupt from within? That question alone changes behavior. Now, zoom out even further. Wars in this region are no longer only about jets, tanks, and old missile inventories. They are increasingly shaped by layered systems, drones, air defense networks, electronic warfare, intelligence fusion, rapid strike chains, commercial satellite observation, open source analysis, cheap sensors, expensive interceptors. The battlefield is becoming more transparent in some ways and more deceptive in others. That shift matters because underground infrastructure used to rely heavily on the idea that if the target could not be clearly seen, it could not be cleanly hit. Today, the picture is different. A target may remain unseen directly and still become legible through patterns. Movement, heat, support behavior, route use, timing, protection methods, and years of collected data can sketch the outline of what is hidden. That does not make every mountain vulnerable tomorrow, but it does mean concealment is no longer what it was. And once concealment weakens, penetrator technology becomes far more valuable. There is also a strategic messaging effect aimed beyond Iran. Every state or group that invested heavily in buried storage, underground launch positions, or mountain-protected logistics is watching this. Some will be reassured that deep sites still survive better than exposed ones. Others will be alarmed that the threshold has shifted. Both reactions can be true at once. Military technology often works like that. It does not instantly erase old systems. It changes the cost-benefit balance around them. We saw that with armor and anti-armor weapons. We saw it with ships and missiles. We saw it with drones and air defenses. And we may be seeing it again with mountain protection and modern bunker busters. That is why this story deserves more than a dramatic thumbnail. It is really a story about confidence. Confidence in engineering. Confidence in deterrence. Confidence in the shield you thought was thick enough. And once confidence breaks, the rebuild is not simple. Iran can dig deeper. It can spread assets out more. It can rely more on mobility. It can invest in deception. It can emphasize retaliation to preserve fear. It can deny damage publicly while adjusting privately. All of those are possible, but none of them are free. They cost money, time, secrecy, and political focus. And if the conflict keeps producing new strike lessons, those investments may age quickly. Let's pause right here. If this kind of careful, no-hype analysis is your thing, hit subscribe now, because the next phase of this story may be less visible on camera, but even more important behind the scenes. Here's another hard truth. A strike like this does not have to eliminate an entire missile program to count as a success from the attacker's point of view. It may only need to do 3 things. First, reduce available stockpiles or access in the short term. Second, force the defender to spend time and resources on recovery and relocation. Third, weaken the defender's confidence in its protected basing model. If all 3 happen, the strategic return could be significant. That is especially true if follow-up surveillance can exploit the defender's response. Think about what happens after a major strike. Emergency vehicles move, engineers arrive, debris gets cleared, alternate routes may be opened, temporary support gear appears. Communication traffic may change. In trying to recover, the site can accidentally reveal even more about how it works. Sometimes the second phase after a strike is almost as valuable to intelligence as the phase before it. The same is true politically. After a dramatic underground strike, leaders face pressure to prove resilience. They may rush out statements. They may organize imagery. They may exaggerate or minimize. They may promise retaliation, or they may talk more carefully to keep room for diplomacy. Every sentence becomes part of a larger struggle over perception. And perception matters because deterrence lives partly in the minds of others. If regional rivals believe Iran's underground shield is weaker than advertised, they may act differently. If Iran believes the United States can now threaten buried stockpiles faster than before, it may distribute weapons differently. If markets believe missile pressure on Gulf shipping is less secure than it was, the belief has economic effects even before any physical change becomes visible. This is why military strikes echo through finance, diplomacy, and domestic politics. They change expectations, and expectations move systems. But there is another side to this story, and it would be irresponsible to ignore it. Whenever advanced militaries prove new destructive reach, there is always the risk of overconfidence. A weapon that works against one target under one set of conditions can become a myth if people stop respecting uncertainty. Not every underground site is built the same. Not every mountain has the same geology. Not every entrance is equally exposed. Not every chamber is equally placed. Not every intelligence picture is equally good. That means success in one strike should not be turned into a fantasy of perfect power. War punishes that kind of arrogance too. The most credible interpretation is not that mountains no longer matter. It is that mountains matter less than they used to when the attacker combines good intelligence with weapons built specifically for deep, hard targets. That is still a huge shift. But it is not magic. And staying serious means resisting magical thinking, whether it comes from triumph or denial. There is a human angle here that often gets lost in the engineering talk. Underground missile programs are staffed by real people, and after a strike, no routine feels routine. New orders, new inspections, more caution, and more fear can slow a force down more than the public realizes. And slowing down matters when your strategy depends on readiness and survivability. Think of an underground missile complex as a promise. The promise says, when the crisis comes, these weapons will still be there, still accessible, still protected, still usable. A bunker-busting strike challenges every word in that promise. Maybe not enough to erase it completely, but enough to stain it. And once a promise is stained in war, trust does not come back easily. Now imagine how this looks from the perspective of allied states watching from the Gulf. For years, many of them have balanced caution, hedging, defense cooperation, and quiet diplomacy. They watch every sign of American capability, every sign of Iranian resilience, and every hint about whether escalation is becoming more or less likely. A strike on a deeply buried missile site sends multiple signals at once. It says the United States is willing to target protected infrastructure. It says U.S. technology is still advancing in the penetration fight. And it says Iran's most secure assets may not be as sheltered as they appear. That can reassure some states. It can also scare them. Will Iran absorb the message and pull back? Will it harden its response? Will proxies act? Will shipping risks rise? A strike can answer one tactical question and open several strategic ones. That is what makes stories like this so important to understand properly. The blast is the beginning, not the ending. And there is one more thing people should keep in mind. Deep protection has always been attractive, partly because of optics. A missile on a transporter in the open is vulnerable and visible. A missile inside a mountain feels permanent. It feels strong. It feels like the state has built something untouchable. That image has domestic power. It projects endurance. So when a bunker buster appears to violate that image, the symbolic damage can spread beyond the military value of the target itself. The mountain stops being a monument to security and starts becoming a question mark. That is a dangerous transformation for any regime that relies on symbols of resilience. This does not mean one strike breaks political control. It means it introduces friction into narratives the state would rather keep clean. And in tightly managed political environments, friction matters. So where does all this leave us? Somewhere between spectacle and reality. The spectacle says a mountain exploded and therefore everything changed overnight. Reality says the strike appears to matter because it challenges a long-standing defense concept, tests Iran's buried missile strategy, and may force costly adaptation, even if the deepest level of physical destruction remains uncertain from the outside. That reality is less cinematic, but it is more powerful, because wars are usually shaped less by one perfect moment than by the accumulation of pressure. A damaged entrance here, a destroyed support node there, a new doubt inside a command room, a rushed relocation, a delayed launch, a more expensive rebuild, a narrower set of choices. Over time, those pressures can bend strategy in ways one explosion alone never could. That is the real danger for Iran if this strike is part of a pattern rather than an isolated event. One strike is a warning. A series of credible strikes becomes a campaign. And campaigns rewrite planning. If that happens, Tehran faces three broad options. First, absorb the E. Lessen and shift harder toward dispersal, mobility, and redundancy instead of trust in a few heavily protected hubs. Second, invest in even deeper and more complex underground systems, betting that engineering can outrun the next generation of penetrators. Third, seek some form of political off-ramp while publicly denying weakness, trying to preserve deterrence without inviting more attacks. In the real world, it may try pieces of all three. That mixed response would fit the way states usually behave under pressure. They adapt militarily, defend politically, and negotiate selectively. The trouble is that mixed responses can also reveal internal division. Some institutions want escalation, some want breathing room, some want symbolic revenge, some want strategic patience. The more severe the shock, the harder those impulses are to keep aligned. And that brings us back to the deepest meaning of the story. At its core, this is not just about a weapon reaching through rock. It is about a weapon reaching through certainty. Iran built certainty into its mountain logic. Certainty that depth buys survival. Certainty that protected storage preserves leverage. Certainty that certain assets can wait out air power. A bunker buster does more than damage concrete. It attacks those certainties. That kind of attack can outlast debris, because debris can be cleared. Certainty is harder to rebuild. Before we land this, do me one quick favor. If this script gave you a sharper view than the usual headlines, share it now with someone who always asks, okay, but what does it actually mean? Now let's close this the right way. Did one bomb end Iran's missile threat? No. Did one strike prove every underground site is now worthless? No. Did this event, if the reporting is broadly right, show that a military doctrine built around depth and secrecy is under real pressure from new U.S. penetration capability? Yes, that is the part people should take seriously. Not because it makes for a dramatic title, but because it changes how future decisions get made. It changes where weapons may be stored. It changes how fast they may move. It changes how safe commanders feel. It changes what regional rivals believe. It changes what engineers are told to build next. And in modern conflict, those quiet changes are often the ones that matter most. A mountain is supposed to be the opposite of doubt. Solid, ancient, protective, final. That is exactly why this story lands so hard. Because when fire seems to come out from inside the mountain, the message is bigger than destruction. The message is that the shield itself may no longer mean what it used to mean. That is why this story will linger. Long after the smoke clears, long after the loudest posts move on, long after officials finish arguing over who won the narrative of the week. Because somewhere inside planning rooms on all sides, people are now recalculating depth, recalculating exposure, recalculating response times, recalculating what can still be trusted under pressure. And once war forces that kind of recalculation, the landscape has already changed. So the most important thing dropped on that mountain may not have been only a bomb. It may have been doubt. And doubt, once it gets underground, is very hard to dig out